As Latter-day Saint leaders, we face very difficult conversations that put us at risk of saying the wrong thing that can do more harm than good. Many of these conversations relate to LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. Have you had a fellow ward member come out to you about their LGBT identity? Have you had LGBT neighbors and you just don't know what to say to them, so you ignore them instead? Have you wrestled with balancing love for your fellow men while still respecting the doctrines of the restored gospel? In order to help, Leading Saints has put together the LGBT Saints Library with more than 20 presentations featuring individuals who have a unique perspective or expertise around this topic. 3 of the most popular sessions are available now to watch. Simply text the word LEAD to 474747 to start watching now, or visit leadingsaints.org/LGBT. Leading Saints is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Latter-day Saints be better prepared to lead. And we do that through content creation, like this podcast, which we hope you will subscribe to. We also have a website at leadingsaints.org with thousands of incredible articles all about leadership in the context of being a Latter-day Saint. We host virtual summits, live events, and also have a weekly newsletter to keep you up to date on all things happening with Leading Saints. Visit leadingsaints.org for more information. All right, today I'm connecting with Kevin Tolley. Did I say your name right, Kevin?
That's right. Opposite of Shorty.
Okay. Nice. You're Tolley, not Shorty, huh?
That's right.
Now, you are one of my Education Week finds. You know, I go to Education Week at BYU, and if you don't know what Education Week is, you're probably under 40, but it's fantastic. And basically, the campus is available for a week, and so they invite people to come. You can buy a ticket and listen to smart guys like Kevin or BYU professors, religion professors, psychologists, and financial planners. I mean, sometimes there's some very interesting topics. So I went to Education Week. Unfortunately, I did not attend your sessions, Kevin. I regret it now, but my brother kept raving about the sessions he was attending. And so I tracked you down and said, you got to do an interview with me. So, I mean, how did you end up at Education Week? And maybe give us some of your background of what you do.
Yeah. I work for the church. I'm an institute director based down in Riverside, California. I've worked for the church for about 20 years, teaching various topics. This is where this idea kind of sprang out. It was a seminary lesson that just got out of control 20 years ago, where we started studying the calls and the releases of all members of the Quorum of the 12. And so over the years, I started compiling some of these things with a colleague of mine named Patrick Bishop, and we put together these stories. And then Education Week just seemed like a great venue to be able to share. It's a great venue to be able to share ideas and concepts and see if anything sticks. So,
yeah. And the typical model of Education Week is basically you have four sessions over 4 days, and it's about an hour-ish each session, and then you sort of unpack these things as the week goes along, right?
Yeah.
So did they approach you about being part of Education Week, or did you apply and get in?
You know, I applied, I think, years ago. And so every few years, like I pop this out and I says, let's give this another whirl. And sometimes I'll switch other topics. My background is really not in church history or American history. I have a PhD in Hebrew Bible. I studied at Notre Dame. I studied theology, undergrad in ancient Near Eastern studies. And so ancient world is where I've usually felt really comfortable. But how can you not be attracted to this idea of a quorum of the 12 apostles? And this concept stretches through Old Testament, New Testament, and we see some of these ideas, but getting to know real life prophets, apostles, and to come to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and see what their lives were like has just been a fascinating journey. So
yeah, that's awesome. Well, I'm excited to jump into it.
Yeah. As far as Education Week, one of the challenges is we're covering the lives of 102 apostles, members of the Quorum of the 12, and they give you 4 days, 4 hours to cover 190 years of history, and so in that venue, I'm usually talking really fast, trying to get through fascinating characters, and we know people like Joseph and Hiram and Oliver, and those names just roll off the tongue. But later in church history, there are just fascinating individuals that Alonzo Hinckley, member of the Quorum of the 12, who has just a really neat story. Just characters that we just aren't familiar with that have lessons we can learn from. So,
yeah, that's awesome. And I love this concept of succession because obviously, we have a deep history in, our general authorities and the Quorum of the 12. And, especially, every decade or so when the Pope dies and they call a new Pope, it's sort of interesting to see their method as everybody watches for the smoke, come up over the Vatican and whatnot. And it's sort of comforting to know, like, well, yeah, if President Nelson dies, it's President Oaks, he's up, and there's obviously a really a method and it's helpful and comforting to sort of have that system in place rather than maybe the politicking that can happen behind the scenes, which you sort of hear about with all the cardinals and whatnot. But then even the succession that we have in our own local wards and stakes where people are called and how are those calls extended and what does it mean? And what about those, I had this feeling that I was going to be the next bishop, but then I wasn't, or I had this feeling I was going to be the next stake president and I was, right? And there's so many of these nuances in the lives of leaders that happen. And so I think it'll be fun to explore some history and learn from their experiences. So where should we begin with all this, Kevin?
I think starting in the very beginning might be the best.
Perfect.
Even as you're talking just now, it just brings stories to my mind about various individuals who experienced some of the same things that you just mentioned about, I thought I was going to be called and I wasn't, or I was called and I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that call, even though it's in the rearview mirror. But back in 1829, when Joseph Smith sat down with the three witnesses, we have this from section 18 of the Doctrine and Covenants, how they begin to pray, and some of our artwork doesn't really depict what really took place. One piece of art depicts Moroni showing a set of plates to Joseph and Oliver and David. Later, David says that Moroni brought a table, and it was like show and tell. Oh, wow. As part of this visionary experience, he brings out the gold plates and brass plates and sword of Laban and other things like that. But as recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants, the three witnesses were challenged at that point to seek out the 12. As early as possibly 1829, that the three witnesses were asked to go find these individuals. And I've thought, what would it be like to be one of the three witnesses in at least this one aspect, this one assignment? How do you go through and find somebody who would fill these legendary shoes, the legendary shoes of Peter and James and John, and do this? And as converts came into the church, this was a challenge that they have. They took about 6 years for them to go through and get to a point where Joseph gave them the green light and says, we're going to extend the call to the Quorum of the 12. Joseph Smith Sr. said of his son, Joseph Smith Jr., that Joseph was charged to find men who believed in the supernatural, that wow. This was not only a testimony of the Savior, but this was a testimony that God still works, that miracles occur. And I think as far as I'm able to determine, there weren't very many other requirements in the very beginning. There was a belief that you needed to have, a belief that God worked and that miracles were real. And so it was not for a number of years until the Quorum of the 12 would be organized. Joseph would stand up in a meeting and say, and it was February 14th, 1835, where Joseph said, all right, Oliver, David, Martin, your time's up. 6 years is up. It's time to choose the Quorum of the 12 apostles. And they would go out and determine from the audience who these individuals were. The issue was only 3 of the 12 were at that meeting. So it made it even more challenging. As they went out, they each chose one individual. And over the next few months, a series of meetings would be held until they got up to the number 9. And then missionaries came back off of their mission and were called immediately to serve as members of the 12. And so you can see, in the very beginning, like I said, I'm not sure exactly what was their thought process, how they chose members of the 12, other than by saying it was through inspiration. After each individual was chosen, Joseph would tell them that they chose correctly. And so that'd be a little nerve-wracking, as like David Whitmer goes out and taps Brigham Young on the shoulder and says, "You're the man," and Joseph goes, "Yep, you're right." Martin Harris goes out and taps on Heber C. Kimball and says, and Joseph goes, "Correct." And I just wonder how nerve-wracking that would be to go out there and try to determine you're the one, and the person with keys is standing right behind me, making sure that my inspiration is correct. Yeah,
and I think that follows a model of today where from what I understand, the president of the church is the one who makes the call on the next apostle. I'm sure they sit in council and maybe discuss names. I would assume like maybe a lot of bishopric meetings and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it comes to the president of the church who says, this is who we're calling, and everybody sustains, right?
Yeah. And there's and multiple models have been used as we go back and study. Like you say, there's been times where the president of the church just walked in the room and says, here's the man. A sustaining vote, and that's all the warning that the Quorum of the 12 had for filling a vacancy. But there's been other times where they've counseled, they've discussed it, they've submitted names. And you're right, the final word goes to that individual who sits as president of the church. If I could jump ahead in church history really quick, Heber J. Grant walked into a meeting. There was a vacancy that needed to be filled, and felt very strongly that a boyhood friend should fill that vacancy. Someone he's known for years and years and years, has been tested and tried, had served as a Army general for a time, served as a stake president, served as completely qualified. He walked in the room and with the Quorum of the 12 to present this name, and he heard a very distinct voice, Melvin J. Ballard. And he thought to himself, I don't even know this guy. He knew him, but not really, not like the boyhood friend, the friend from decades gone by. And he thought for a second, and he heard the voice again, Melvin J. Ballard. So he crumpled up the piece of paper with the name of his friend on it. And he said, the name I propose is Melvin J. Ballard. I think of that story, if you just go back and maybe I'm jumping in time already, but do you remember they had to fill the vacancy in the Quorum of the 12 after Judas left the quorum through death?
To say the least.
I don't know how to properly, but they sat in council and they boiled down to two names. One man was named Joseph and the other man was named Matthias. After some deliberation, Matthias was the man, and he'll fill the vacancy in the 12. As we look at church history in a larger spectrum, that guy Joseph is my hero. Being found worthy, but not having to serve, man, that guy is the guy I want to be like. Worthy, but not having to really do the hard work. And so I want to be on the list, but I don't want to fill the seat,
Yeah, and we don't really know much about who he is, right?
No, but I just imagine that guy in the spirit world with his set of scriptures with those verses highlighted. Because I could have been there, man. Yeah. But I got to sit home with my wife and kids. Nice. Probably died peacefully in his sleep later in his life, just lived a happy life. But there is, as we go through, we want to inflict the modern Quorum of the 12 anciently and just put that back into history. And we want to put kind of our ideas and concepts that we're familiar with today back in time and say, this is how it's been always. We're a church restored, and therefore it's always been the same, which is not necessarily the case. God has been far more creative in the way he governs the church and the way things have functioned. But it's interesting that in early church history, if you sneezed wrong, you'd be removed out of the Quorum of the 12. And there's just a number of just fascinating stories. Like, for instance, Orson Hyde and William McClellan, two early members of the Quorum of the 12, serve a mission. They are missionary companions, and they go serve for a few months. That was the primary responsibility of the Quorum of the 12, was to preach the gospel. And these two members of the 12 went and did that. As they go out, William McClellan writes a letter to his wife, Emmeline, and asks her if she's going to go to school in the fall. And education was a priority in Kirtland. And as we know, School of Prophets and other establishments that try to teach the saints, his wife just made a comment, says, I'm really busy. I don't know if I'll be able to. And William McClellan says, well, it's probably good. Orson Hyde's with me, and he's a superior teacher. And until he gets back, I don't know how well the school's really going to be run, because he is professional school teacher. Well, this letter that he wrote back, just making that slight comment that Orson Hyde was a superior teacher, got back to Sidney Rigdon, the current teacher, who was serving the first presidency, and was quite upset that a members of the 12 would speak like this about him. And so they removed him out of the 12 while they were still serving missions. They didn't know they were removed out of the 12 till they got back. They got back and they says, we've been released? We've only been serving for 3 months, 4 months. They came back and apologized, as we did not mean anything by that letter. And so they were welcomed back right into the 12. But they were removed. They were the first ones to be removed out of the 12 because of a slight comment.
So were they replaced during that time, or?
Nope, they came back, and this would happen pretty. It was just a pretty common thing. If you did something slight, you'd be removed. If you came back and apologized, you'd be put right back in. And so we think of this drawn out process of releasing or excommunication or something. A little more extreme example. I'm going to foil that against another story where Joseph and his younger brother William get into a bad argument one day in December of 1835. The Quorum of the 12 has been organized since February, so the Quorum of the 12 has been around for 10 months. And Joseph and William's argument inflated to such an extent that it went to blows. They began to fight. Well, I think the fight was a little one-sided because as Joseph and William begin to argue, Joseph begins to take off his coat. As he's taking off his coat, it's around his elbows when William lunges at him and knocks him to his back. Now Joseph's arms are successfully pinned beneath him because of his coat was around his elbows. And William began to wail on his brother. All right. Joseph would complain later that after that beating, it was uncomfortable to sit, lie, or stand. And I'm not sure what other options there are after that. Either you're sitting, you're lying, or standing, right?
Yeah.
And after this, here is a member of the Quorum of the 12 that just beat up the prophet, And at the end of this, Joseph didn't think much of it. But other members of the Quorum of 12 says, I don't think that's right. And so they removed him out of the 12. It wasn't Joseph's doing. Apparently, Joseph was used to wrestling and fighting with his brothers, but there's a decorum that comes with the 12 that they hadn't learned yet, that apparently you don't punch one another. Apparently, Joseph or William would later say, I punched you as a brother and not as an apostle, as part of his apology, he would make that trademark statement.
So when they removed them, when William was removed from the quorum, was it wasn't Joseph in the meeting and say, hey, don't do that? I mean, it's not a big deal. We're just family here. Or were these decisions that the Quorum of the 12 was just making?
The charges were brought against them. And there was a bit of a feeling that this was inappropriate behavior. And so once word got back to William, William he takes a little time, takes a couple weeks to cool off. He'll go back to Joseph and apologize. And what I've noticed is you can do just about anything to Joseph and he would forgive you. Joseph will have good qualities, rough qualities. He's still being polished. But one quality that Joseph has that I think is very impressive is on most instances, he would forgive if you just came back and apologized. From a beating with fists to a misspoken word, Joseph, to William McClellan Orson Hyde, he just says, I frankly forgave them, and that's Joseph's just kind of personality trait. One that I wish I had, how quickly he would forgive.
As far as you mentioned, peculiarities in the 12, what are some stories in that realm?
Yeah. When the Quorum of the 12 was first organized, they organized the Quorum of the 12 by age. And so they're organizing in February. By about May, they have had this organization where the oldest, who was about 35, down to about 23, all Quorum of the 12. But they really had to determine, how the quorum functions and who's in charge. And so what they would often do is they would rotate who was president for a while. And they'd go, the senior would be president, and then they'd go down to the next senior and down all the way down. So everyone had a turn to conduct and practice being in charge of the meetings. Eventually, Thomas B. Marsh will be set apart or recognized as president of the 12. But this idea of age will stick for a while. And they have trouble getting this idea out of their head that if you're older, you should be in charge. And so when new members, when members of the Quorum of 12 fall out and new ones come in, something interesting happens. And they'll call Wilford Woodruff as a member of the Quorum of the 12. And John Taylor had been serving for about 4 months. But because Wilford Woodruff was older, they leapfrogged him in seniority. And this leapfrog would stay in until about 1861. And so for the next almost 20 years, Wilford Woodruff would have seniority over John Taylor. And it wasn't until Brigham Young decided, no, this needs to be time in the 12 and not age. Now, Brigham is an eclectic individual and he has a lot of interesting ideas. And so he will flip-flop on this occasionally. And earlier in his life, he has a very strong testimony of temple ordinances. And when he is sealed to his wife, he has a very strong feeling that children that were produced from that union, those who were born in the covenant, would, in fact, basically rule the world. He had this feeling that these were special individuals who were born in the covenant who would do great things in their life. And so at one point, he ordains one of his sons by the name of John W. Young. He ordains him to the office of apostle. The issue is John W. Young is 11 at the time.
Oh, wow.
He'll ordain 3 of his sons apostles well before there's a vacancy in the quorum, but they'll hold the office of apostle without being in the quorum. Now, comparing the story of Wilford Woodruff and John Taylor, in one meeting, Brigham Young is there, and his one of his secretaries by the name of Joseph F. Smith is in the room, and he says, "When the Spirit moves upon me, I intend to act upon it." And he had Joseph Smith bring a chair in the middle of the room and ordained Joseph F. Smith as a member of the Quorum of the 12. Or excuse me, an apostle first, and a few months later, a member of the Quorum of the 12. But what's interesting is since Brigham Young Jr. had been ordained as a young man, when he is called in the 12, he will leapfrog Joseph F. Smith. And so his belief is it's not just time in the Quorum of the 12, but it's time as a member of that quorum. As time as an apostle. Yeah. And so at times you will he'll flip-flop different names and reorganize the quorum, not only by age, but how long you've been an apostle, how long you've been in the 12. And there's a lot of other factors that at least Brigham will bring into this.
Yeah. So, and really that impacts who becomes church president in the future, I would imagine, right? If they're taking different spots in the quorum.
He'll remove individuals like Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt and remove their seniority because they spent some time outside of the Quorum of the 12. And so he'll remove their quorum and kind of bring them down a notch or two. And so you can see during Brigham Young's era, if you look at the Quorum of the 12, that they're still trying to figure a few things out. And people come into the quorum with different background. And so they're still trying to figure out, how does this function? How does the quorum really work in the world? In fact, the quorum had been out serving missions for so long that they went for 32 years without ever meeting together as a quorum.
Wow.
That there's always somebody gone. There's always somebody missing. And it was so momentous that they all got back together in 1868 that they decided to take a photo of the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12 for the first time together in 32 years. Always gone, always working. And so,
wow.
Yeah, the quorum, how the quorum functions just works line upon line. And as Brigham gets older, he begins to do things to help alleviate some burden. At one point, he will call roughly 6 to 7 counselors in the first presidency because the Quorum of the 12 primarily functioned as missionaries, and running the administration of the church became taxing as he got older. And so he'll call, I think there'll be 8 people in the first presidency at one point to help bear off the weight of the administrative burden that they're carrying.
And all these individuals aren't always necessarily called from the Quorum of the 12 like we see today.
No. Some will be apostles, will hold the priesthood office as apostle, but not all come from the quorum. He doesn't pull them out because that would pull them away from their primary responsibility of preaching the gospel. And he doesn't want to pull them out of the field. And so he'll bring in other individuals.
And when this was happening because now if you're in the first presidency, like when Elder Uchtdorf was President Uchtdorf, he presided, he was the presiding authority in meetings, even if, President Nelson was there, right? And so was that tradition still there where there's a presiding component of the first presidency over the Quorum of the 12?
Yeah, and so they're going to go and take care of administrative business. I'm not sure if anyone really, if there was an issue of I'm in charge in this room and you're not. It was, we have responsibilities and we're going to take care of our responsibilities, whether it be, administrative tithing funds and things along those lines, temple construction, and just bearing off immigration and things like that. So,
yeah. And I'm curious, I don't mean to jump around in your outline, but this concept of presiding is interesting. And it's a thing, and I recognize it's a thing. It's an important thing to understand, but there's also a deep tradition in it to the point where we're like, I don't really like, why does it really matter that the second counselor of the stake presidency is here and he's presiding when he doesn't really know what's going on, right? So was that a concept from the beginning of of the quorum and of the keys restored, or was that maybe something that came over time?
It definitely has grown over time and evolved and morphed, developed over time. And where someone in maybe in a ward, a bishop, almost has to have an eagle eye, and be almost borderline clairvoyant because of all the responsibilities they need to have from that stand to make sure that there's order and that things are running properly. I think as things begin, Joseph was the final word. Mm-hmm. And there needed to be some sort of line of authority. When I'm not here, who's in charge? And so the Doctrine and Covenants, and one of the first, revelations that were given as part of a training for the Quorum of the 12 was Section 107. And so where some of these lines of authority are beginning to be outlined. What do we do, if a counselor is here, et cetera? And so essentially, when Joseph is there, he's in charge. If he's not, a counselor's in charge. And where the first presidency is not, the Quorum of the 12 takes the lead. And so that was one of the trainings that they get from Section 107. If these questions that you're asking right now is how do we preside? Who's in charge? Who do we turn to if there's conflict, if a question arises? And that question is not clearly understood. We all understood that Joseph was in charge, but when Joseph passes, it becomes problematic. Brigham Young comes back like a thunderstorm, coming back into Nauvoo, going, the Quorum of the 12 leads. But Sidney Rigdon had come back beforehand, and he is smooth in the way he speaks. People liked him typically. At one point, there was a conflict between Joseph and Sidney, and Joseph tries to release Sidney out of the first presidency, and the people don't sustain it.
Oh, wow.
And it frustrates Joseph. He goes, all in favor of releasing him, and we don't say this anymore, right? We thank them and they ride off in the sunset. But Joseph goes, all in favor of releasing Sidney. And nobody wanted that. People liked to hear him speak. He was charismatic. Mm-hmm. And Joseph got very frustrated. He says, I have tried to throw him off my shoulders and you've thrown him back. I throw him onto your shoulders now. Like he was just very frustrated with Sidney. And when Sidney comes back after the martyrdom of Joseph, he doesn't want to be the president of the church. He doesn't want to lead the Quorum of the 12, but he feels like there needs to be a guardian of truth. And so that's what he proposes himself as I want to be a guardian of the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. And that's how he frames it, that these teachings are real. There's good things in here. Brigham had an understanding of keys and how things should function. At least he's beginning to. I'm sure there was lots he needed to learn, but he came back and that was his message. We are the Quorum of the 12 and we preside where there's no first presidency. Brigham, with this sharp sense of humor, says to Sidney, he says, if you want to be Joseph's counselor, go where he is right now, and gives him that challenge.
That's great. Any other, I'm trying to have a hard time saying this, peculiarities in the 12 that we haven't mentioned? There
might be, as things go on, as we turn the century into the 20th century, things really begin to stabilize. And there are some interesting documents in the 19th century where they were still kind of working things out, and they didn't know exactly how everything functioned. Things were revealed line upon line. But as we come into the 20th century, I think a lot of these peculiarities begin to kind of hammer themselves out. Although we have individuals like David McKay, who towards the end of his life kind of follows in the footsteps of Brigham Young, expands the first presidency, and initially asked Hugh B. Brown, to come into, to be an assistant to the first presidency. And he's very clear. Hugh B. Brown was the first one. He says, you are an assistant to the 12. And then later we'll call a third and fourth and fifth counselor, but towards the end of his life, he'll, he goes, I'm carrying too much. I need to offload. And so you'll see some adjustments.
And so when David O. McKay, expanded the first presidency to multiple counselors, was he ordaining each one of these individuals to the office of apostle, or was it more an administrative thing?
And throughout church history, members of the first presidency, there is no requirement. And in fact, if I'll jump back a little bit, it was in 1931 where the second counselor in the first presidency, a man by the name of Charles Nibley, his grandson is fairly famous, named Hugh. But Charles Nibley was the presiding bishop of the church before he was called as a second counselor in the first presidency. when he passes away, they discuss who should fill this vacancy. Charles Nibley did some wonderful work, and they says, who can be this individual? And finally, they came to this conclusion, I know the right man. And so they wrote a letter to an individual by the name of J. Reuben Clark. And they wrote him a letter asking him to be in the first presidency. And J. Reuben Clark politely wrote a letter back, says, I'd love to, but I'm really busy. But the reason I bring in this story is not that he turned down the calling of the first presidency. The president of the church, Heber J. Grant, just said, hey, listen, we'll wait for you. And they waited for roughly 18 months for him to finish his business working for the government. I think he was an ambassador at the time down to Mexico. And so they allowed him to kind of clean things up. When he came in the first presidency, they ordained him. He was a member of a stake Quorum of the 70, something that we really don't have today. But they ordained him to the office of high priest. And he'll serve in the first presidency for almost a year before they will set him apart as a member. They will ordain him to the office of apostle. And later he'll have a seniority ranking in the 12. But he came in and they ordained him a high priest. And that was, President Winder under Joseph F. Smith served as in that office. One other quick little thing about offices in the priesthood. Joseph Smith made a comment that all priesthood is Melchizedek. Alvin R. Dyer was called as a counselor, an additional counselor to David O. McKay, and was ordained to the office of apostle. When David O. McKay passed away, the first presidency was dissolved, and Alvin R. Dyer would later serve as a member of the Quorum of the 70 and ordained to the office of the 70. He's the only person that I know of in church history who went from the office of apostle to the office of 70. And I think it's not a common thing for a situation like that to arise. But keep in mind Joseph's comments, all priesthood is Melchizedek. He's not being demoted. He's just giving additional or different assignments. And so,
interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
And so, what was did you say the specific reason of why he became a 70 after being apostle? He
was called in the Quorum of the 70. And to serve went from the first presidency. And he was an assistant, assistant or fourth counselor along those lines. And then as the administration changed, they felt strongly to go in another direction. Nice. Another office that was just kind of interesting that we don't have anymore was an assistant to the 12.
Yeah.
And for a while, those individuals were ordained high priests and would serve. The first one that was called was a man by the name of Marion G. Romney. He will later serve in the Quorum of the 12 in the first presidency. But Marion G. Romney was the very first person called as an assistant to the 12, and he was called out of the audience without any warning. He was just called and says, Marion G. Romney. And they called about 4, 5, 6 individuals. He says, I don't remember any of the other names. When my name was read, that was it. Now, I bring up that story for 2 reasons. Number one, as the first member, first individual as an assistant to the 12, or as this unique calling. But something else was interesting is all of his friends began to kind of, tell him when there was a vacancy in the 12, they said, Marion, you are shoo-in to be a member of the Quorum of the 12. You've been trained. God is preparing you right now. You're the man. You're going to be there, And he began to believe it. And when there was a vacancy in the 12 that arose, he thought for sure he's going to get a phone call, sat by the phone waiting for it to come. And the phone call never came. Another individual was called in the Quorum of the 12, and Marion G. Romney kind of had a chiding from the Holy Ghost, saying, listen, you're seeking for positions. Stop it. And Marion G. Romney, bless his heart, began to, on a personal journey, said, I want to try to get these feelings out of my heart. This pride, I just want this out. So he began to fast about it. He fasted every Sunday about this issue. I don't want to seek position. I need pride out of my heart. And so he fasted every single Sunday for 7 years. Wow. At the end of the 7 years, he finally just sat down and, how do you really write this in your journal? I have pride under control. That's a hard statement to write down. And so, but he does write, he goes, I'm in a good place. I know that I'm where God needs me to be, and I'm not seeking for anything else. I will just do what God asked me to do. And he wrote that in his journal, and the very next day, he was called by the president of the church to serve as a member of the Quorum of the 12.
Oh, wow.
And it just seems as though God is refining us in really unique ways. And here is Marion G. Romney It was one of the greats in church history.
Yeah.
But I think he's great because that private thing that he did on his own,
Yeah. So with this calling of assistant to the 12, which lasted, I think, till the early 80s, right? Until President Kimmel just said, they're all 70s now, and we have quorums, and we're getting a little more organized here for modern times. But it seems like for many years, the vacancies in the Quorum of the 12 came from these assistants to the 12. Like I think James E. Faust was in the was an assistant to 12, and many others. And they were they ordained to the office of 70 at that time, or were they just simply high priests?
We have a long list, from 1941 to about 1980, this long list of individuals who served. I believe, and I don't know if I can say this for every single one, but they were ordained high priests. That was kind of the typical thing.
And were their responsibilities different than a 70 then?
I can't determine the difference because in my mind right now, when I think of 70, they are to assist the 12 in their labors. And I just think, well, how would that be different?
Yeah.
And maybe they were just more closely associated. In my mind, this is how I see things, that the 7 presidents of the 70 kind of fill the role that was taking up before. And that the 7 presidents of the 70 helped organize and they work almost a liaison between the 12 and the 70 and help things function. And still carry a lot of the administrative responsibilities so the 12 can go and preach the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And it just makes me wonder how much currently, like when a 70 comes to a stake as a visiting authority and maybe calling a stake president and setting apart that stake president, obviously keys are involved, and 70s don't necessarily have keys, but they are sort of delegated keys in those moments, special assignments to, function in place of the Quorum of the 12. And so it makes me wonder if that concept was solidified with these assistants to the 12, if they were going out and conducting business like that, where they were, taking keys and assuming the role of keys for a weekend and visiting stakes and whatnot. I don't know.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of the keys, that this authority can be delegated, and the amount of pressure that's put on the Quorum of the 12 to speak, to teach, their primary responsibilities, but their responsibilities are also to individuals, to go and seek the one. But then they also have to carry on, so many, the missionary department, the temple department, these various, aspects, and anything they can do to kind of share that burden would help them work move faster. So,
tell us a little bit about some unexpected deaths. I mean, when I think of that, I think of Harold B. Lee, right? Everybody's sustained his prophet, and he's in his early 70s. You think we're going to have a prophet for decades, right? And quickly, it's 18 months or something that suddenly he passes away. But there's some more dramatic, unexpected deaths in the Quorum of the 12.
Yeah. In fact, let's just key off of that one just for a second. In a fascinating book called From Heart to Heart, an autobiography by Russell M. Nelson that he wrote. He wrote about a visionary experience that he had where Harold B. Lee came and visited him in a dream. And he asked the question, why did you leave? You're only in for 18 months. That was unexpected. Why? And the response was interesting. He says, I contracted an illness that would be embarrassing to myself and to the church. And it was decided that I should just go home. And, that's an interesting comment, that Elder Russell M. Nelson makes, because why aren't we all called home before the embarrassment of dementia and other things set in? If God is a God of healing, why can't he heal an individual? Why that option, and that's the question. Sometimes we needed, it's a personal issue. Why did he get the blessing when other individuals don't, and other individuals need to stay a little bit longer? One really interesting story is a man by the name of Alonzo Hinckley. I remember the Quorum of the 12 back in the 1930s. He was called in the Quorum of the 12 and immediately was diagnosed with cancer, almost immediately. And so what a lot of these individuals would do in the early 20th centuries, late 19th century, is you'd go sit on the beach, because that heals all, right? Joseph Smith, as a young man, leg operation. As soon as his healing process involved sitting on the beach, right? You go and sit in that salt air. Well, Alonzo Hinckley goes down to Southern California and sits on the beach. And I don't know if that's going to cure cancer, but probably cause more cancer with the sun and everything. But he goes out there and just smelling the salt air. He says that he drifted off for a time, just fell asleep. And his father woke him up. His father had been dead for quite some time. And he says, Alonzo, you're coming home. And Elder Hinckley says, no, I've been just called in the Quorum of the 12. I'm not coming. I have work to do. I have things to do. This dream repeated 3 times, where his father would come and says, it's time to come home. It's time to come home. And he says, no, I am not coming home. He goes back to the first presidency. He goes back to Salt Lake and he says, I need to be released. And the answer is no. I'm sorry. He's not the only one who sought to be released from this calling, felt overwhelmed or felt like, I don't know. But he was told no. He was living with his daughter Afton for a time. And his daughter went off to go grab some groceries, came back, checked on her dad. He says, Dad, how are you doing? And he says, I'm doing great. He says, really? Because you've been really sick. You've been bedridden. He says, why so good? He says, while you're gone, 3 individuals came and visited me dressed in the robes of the priesthood. They gave me a blessing and they said, I'm going home. And so he will serve, if I remember right, just about a year in the Quorum of the 12, I think 14 months. And a member of the Quorum of the 12 will be called in. Some calls come really unexpected. Another individual, let's see, by the name of George Q. Morris was called in the Quorum of the 12. He is called at age 80. All right. And so here's an individual. Usually, you think, well, somebody that's young, that can go out and take care of business. One of his first assignments as a member of the Quorum of the 12 was to serve on the church's softball committee, and he was there faithfully.
That was a committee?
Right. Yeah. And so apparently the youth had a softball league in the church, and sports was big business back in the 1950s. And they had all church basketball tournaments. They had all church softball tournaments. And that was one of his administrative responsibilities.
And this is in the 60s when he's called, right? I'm just Googling as we're talking.
Let's see. He comes in, if I remember right, in 1954, if I remember right. But I could be off. But we have, some of these calls come at just really unusual times. There was another man, he was called in 1950, a man by the name of Delbert Stapley. He was a stake president, and there was a vacancy in the Quorum of the 12, and he was invited to come up to General Conference. Many, even today, stake presidents are given tickets and are allowed to come to go to stake conference. He decided to travel and go to General Conference, but he was nervous because he had this impression, and he didn't know if it was a real impression or his own heart or what, that he'd be called in the Quorum of the 12. He got a hotel room in the Hotel Utah, now currently the Joseph Smith building. And for those who are unfamiliar, that building is just essentially across the street from the Tabernacle where they held General Conference. President Stapley, stake president, would leave his hotel room and run down to General Conference during the opening hymn. All right, he'd show up late. He didn't want anyone to talk to him. And during the closing hymn, he would excuse himself out and he would just go back to his hotel room. And he would do this for all the sessions. He didn't want anyone to know he was there. He didn't want anybody to recognize what was going on. And
trying to game the system, right? Yeah,
that's right. It's like Jonah, isn't it? If no one knows where I'm at, He one evening he's like, I'm starving. I need to go get something to eat. Now keep in mind, General Conference was not 2 days back then. It was a few more days than just the 2 days. He goes, I'm starving. He goes, something to eat. He's like, I think everybody's gone. Everybody's gone to bed. I'm going to go downstairs and I'm going to go get something to eat. And so he goes down the elevator. Elevator doors open up. He looked at the lobby. It's free and clear. So he's like, I can make it across, go grab something to eat. He's walking across the lobby and he hears his name. And he turns around and there's George Albert Smith, president of the church. He goes, President Stapley, I've been looking all over for you. It just so happened it was the one time that he left his room to go get something to eat. Wow. President Smith extended the call to be a member of the Quorum of the 12 right there in the foyer of the Joseph Smith building.
Nice. Good old hallway calling. They'll still happen.
That's right.
That's awesome.
And not to put him in too rough of a light. Later in his life, towards the end of his life, Elder Stapley, his kids came to him and says, you got to slow down, Dad. You were working too hard. And his reply back, he says, I was not called in the Quorum of the 12 to sit still. And he will literally wear out his life in the service of the Quorum and of the kingdom. So
what else? Any other unexpected calls? These are fun.
Yeah, I'll do one more. This is one of my favorites. Heber J. Grant was called. He was in his late 20s when he was called in the Quorum of the 12. And there's so many fun stories about Heber J. Grant, but let me just limit to just this one idea. He was called in the Quorum of the 12. There was a vacancy in the Quorum of the 12 for almost 2 years. The first presidency in the Quorum of the 12 just weren't filling the vacancies. When the vacancies were filled, it was by Heber J. Grant and another man by the name of George Teasdale. Okay. Heber J. Grant felt completely overwhelmed. He was in his late 20s. To be a member of the Quorum of the 12, he just didn't feel qualified. He'd already served as a stake president out in Tooele, but he felt completely overwhelmed. He does not tell this story until he's president of the church. This is a very sacred story to him. He was on assignment, I believe, down in Arizona, and he was with a group of individuals, brand new member of the Quorum of the 12, junior member, and he just didn't feel qualified. He didn't feel like he should be there. And so he, on his way down to Arizona, he told the other individuals he was traveling with, he goes, please, let me have some time alone. Travel on ahead. I'm just going to go on this road, you on that road, and I'll meet up with you. And they warned him about some of the dangers that were in the area. And he says, I'll be fine. And so somewhere, I don't know where exactly, in my mind, I live in Southern California. When I go up to Utah, I just travel I-15. I just kind of, my mind's eye, pictured young Heber J. Grant off by one of those shrub oaks somewhere. And he says he knelt down and he just poured out his soul and he goes, it shouldn't be me, And he says a vision opened to his mind where he began to see, he began to hear what he saw as a divine council. He saw the Savior enthroned in this council with other individuals. He says the Savior spoke and said, the first presidency in the Quorum of the 12 are having difficulty filling the vacancies in the 12. Do you have any suggestions? Let's just open up to discussion, and in this vision, he saw an individual stand up. He says he recognized him instantly as the prophet Joseph Smith. And he says, I nominate Heber J. Grant. He sat down. He says, another individual stood up. And he says he recognized, Heber J. Grant says, I recognize him instantly too. It was Jedediah Morgan Grant, who served as a member of the first presidency with Brigham Young and was Heber's father. He says, I second the nomination. And he says, we'll move forward with the name Heber J. Grant. And then the vision closed. This story that Heber J. Grant tells, he doesn't tell it until he becomes president of the church. Very sacred experience that he has, but it just taught me a little bit about, I think, how God functions. That I think, like in my mind, I just want to be a good soldier. I just want to salute and say, God, tell me what to do, and we'll just move on, right? And my prayers reflect that. God, tell me what to do, I'll do it. I don't know what to do in this situation. Tell me what to do, I will go. I just want to be like Nephi, I'll go and do. And I wonder, here is a vision of the Savior sitting in council. The Savior, a being who knows all, asked other individuals, what do you think? What do you, from your perspective? And I think God is trying to train us a lot, and death doesn't get us out of this training. Here's Joseph and Jedediah sitting in this council and they're still giving their opinion. They're still helping with the kingdom. And the veil got to be pulled back for a minute and Heber J. Grant got to see a piece of it. But this vision, this story changed me personally, just the way I pray. Because I know the question's going to ask, if I ask God, what do you want me to do in this situation? The question's almost invariably, what do you think? Yeah. And I think there's some play in this.
Yeah, I really appreciate that story as well, because there's all this pressure sometimes, being in a bishopric or in a stake presidencies of like calling people. And sometimes you can get trapped in this, like, well, I just want to do what the Lord wants me to do. Right. So we're going to pick the elders quorum instructor or the, a primary instructor. And we got to know who's the name, God, like, who is it? Right. And a lot of times, like, I gave you the authority. I gave you the keys, like, make a decision and move on. Like, I don't have some chalkboard in heaven where I'm writing down every name that goes in every calling. Sometimes he gives us a lot of autonomy because we are agents of action. Right. And as leaders, we make decisions, even though, maybe God would have made a different decision, but that's okay.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And how the Spirit works on an individual. I find it's interesting that there's been times in church history, and we don't see it today. And when I say church history, I'm thinking like the 1930s, the 1940s, even. There'd be a vacancy in the 12, and they'd struggle over it, and the vacancy would last for a year. And it's not that they just ignored it, that we're fine with 11 right now, or the first presidency, we get along with 2 of us. They're really seeking out what God wants. Now, let me just tell you just one other quick story about Heber J. Grant. When he comes into the Quorum of the 12, there's 2 vacancies in the 12, if you remember. He was serving as stake president out in Tooele. He goes into general conference and he's in the crowds trying to find a seat. And he sees his good friend, George Teasdale. George Teasdale looks at him and he goes, and he yells across, he goes, "Heber, today you and I are going to be called," and he starts coughing uncontrollably. And then he walks away. Heber J. Grant says, "The Spirit filled in the line, a member of the Quorum of the 12. And it shocked him. He's like, "Are you kidding?" So the meeting begins and ends and nobody's called. And Heber's like, "The Spirit whispered to me, my friend yelled across, like I'm the guy." No. And so he goes back home at the end of general conference. No one's called. He gets a telegraph later from Salt Lake, says, "Please come to Salt Lake." And he goes, "No." And the telegraph comes again. He goes, "We need you in Salt Lake." He says, "I'm needed in Tooele. I have state conference coming up. I'm preparing for it." "No, because the president of the church needs to talk to you." And he goes, "I'll be there." Okay. And so he comes in to Salt Lake. And as he comes in to meet with the first presidency to get this call issued to him, he passes by his friend, George Teasdale. And George Teasdale looks at him and goes, "Heber, I'm sorry. I'm sorry." And that's all he'll say. Afterwards, George Teasdale confided to him. He says, "A few weeks ago when I saw you in general conference, I had this impression that I would be called in the Quorum of the 12. I told God I couldn't do it. And God told me," he says, "Don't worry, Heber will sit next to you." And he says, "Okay, I can do it. If I have my good friend Heber, I can do it." And I was so excited that I began to yell out in conference, as they were coming in. He says, "We're going to be called. Like, I'm excited. I get to sit next to Heber J. Grant, He says, halfway through the sentence, the Spirit told me stop. So I pretended to cough and walked away. And I've always loved George Teasdale for that. Like, there's been times when the Spirit whispered something to me and I says, "Hold on, I have something to say, wait till I'm done." And here's an individual who was sensitive enough to listen to the Holy Ghost and act immediately. These guys are just fascinating individuals.
Yeah. So I gotta have you tell these are the names we're more familiar with, like Henry B. Eyring when he was called to the first presidency. What's that story?
Yeah. Let's go in the modern era a little bit to some names that you're familiar with. He was called in the first presidency, and President Hinckley apparently had a phone that had members of the Quorum of the 12 on speed dial. Now, keep in mind, this is in the 90s, and so this is high tech. This isn't. But President Hinckley was completely efficient, and got a lot done. But at times would pick up the phone, hit somebody in the speed dial, give them an assignment, and then hang up and call the next person, give them an assignment. And sometimes, occasionally, President Hinckley would press the wrong button. And as he's trying to get work done and be efficient and get the work moving, he would hit a button. A member of the Quorum of the 12 would pick up, and he would just give the assignment. And so
President Hinckley would think he was talking to somebody else, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And hey, you know what? Maybe that person needed to hear. I don't know. So Elder Henry B. Eyring one evening comes home. He was pulling in the garbage cans, from the street. And in my mind, I never pictured apostles doing things like this, but he was pulling in the garbage cans when his wife came out with the cordless phone and said, "President Hinckley's on the phone." So he grabbed the phone, garbage can in one hand, the phone in the other, and he goes, "This is hell." Or he goes, "Hello?" And the assignment came, "I'm calling you to the first presidency." And so the reply back from Elder Eyring was, "President, this is Hal Eyring. Are you sure you pressed the right button?" And President Hinckley goes, "I know who I'm talking to. I'm calling you to the first presidency." And the call was brief, to the point, and cut right to the chase. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, but he was taken back. He didn't think that he was the one.
That's interesting. And I guess President Nelson, since he's been president of the church, filling vacancy in the 12, he's taken a different approach. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Let me just back to just one short story. For instance, Elder Holland, who we all know and love, he was called at home 10 o'clock at night by the president of the church. Asked him if he wouldn't mind, if he wasn't too busy, if he would meet with him, I think at 8 a.m. the next morning. And so Elder Holland assured him he would. And so the next morning, over a sleepless night, I'm sure, Elder Holland was there meeting with President Hunter. And President Hunter extended the call to him and then brought him immediately over to the temple where he was set apart and then went for the rest of the day, full day of meetings. And this has been the pattern Like,
I hope he
this.
didn't have anything else on his calendar that day.
I know. It's just fascinating. And it happened in June. It wasn't even like general conference. It was just like, we're going to call you. We're just going to jump right through. Now, think about this. There's been times where individuals were called into the Quorum of the 12 and their spouse heard about it over the radio or on TV from general conference. That's how their spouse was notified. For the first time in general conference, for the first time in church history, Elder Gong and Elder Suarez are last two, numbers 101, 102 members of the Quorum of the 12. For the first time in church history, President Nelson invited the spouse in. I'm not saying that Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, or anyone else did it wrong, but President Nelson has set a new precedent. We're going to call the spouse in and have them be involved with the call. And with each of these, President Nelson has taken the individual and their wife by the hand, and they sat there in a little triangle. Okay. And they each held hands when he extended the call. And so this is something new that's never happened in church history. Something else that's new that President Nelson has started is how he organized the first presidency. Typically what takes place is when the first presidency is dissolved, the Quorum of the 12 meets together, and sometimes there will be as many as 14 members of the Quorum of the 12, meet together. And the second in seniority will nominate the first in seniority and then set them apart. He is set apart. He's not ordained a prophet. He's already been a prophet for years, for decades, right? But they're set apart as the president of the church. So President Nelson was set apart by President Oaks. This has been the pattern that's gone through, except for Joseph F. Smith was set apart by the church patriarch. It's the only exception. Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that's unique about President Nelson is as this meeting was brought together, President Nelson decided to interview every member in that room, interviewed them separately, and each of them brought forth names of who they thought they should be in the first presidency. And they were not allowed to counsel with one another, not to compare notes or anything like that. They had to sit in silence as he interviewed each of those individuals.
Oh, wow.
And then he prayed about it, came out and said, all right, my first counselor, Dallin H. Oaks. That's how much notice Elder Oaks had to be in the first presidency, and then Henry B. Eyring, who has had some experience in the first presidency. But that's been a new precedent where they've gone through and interviewed every individual and everyone's got to nominate some names, and make some suggestions.
Yeah. And a lot of people may not realize this, but in the process of, I've been through the process of calling a stake presidency when I was called into the stake presidency. And, as you meet with, I was a bishop at the time and I met with a visiting authority and they asked for names of who I thought would serve as a great stake president. Now, for the record, the stake president's name was on my list. So I'm just saying, I'm pretty good at it. But then he called me as his counselor. So it came back to me. But yeah, so it's sort of a little bit of that type of experience of just saying and I love that the spirit of counsel there, all right, if it was up to you, who would you call in the first presidency? And that, I can see how that can really help a leader talk through something or think through that decision and seek deeper inspiration.
Yeah. There's some times where I think the Spirit intervenes fairly directly, and we've seen that in church history. And there's other times where counsel, where let's talk about this for a minute and allow inspiration to come through that counsel, and so. Yeah,
that's awesome. As far as you have this section here, as far as being foretold, and you've talked about Alonzo Hinckley already, but what do you mean about this concept of being foretold?
I think that there's individuals that at times are told beforehand. Hugh B. Brown, for instance, great member, dynamic speaker, great member of the Quorum of the 12 in the first presidency. He was told when he was a missionary walking to a meeting, and somebody said, I think it was Heber J. that made the comment, says somebody in this room will serve as a member of the Quorum of the 12. George Albert Smith, president of the church, when he was a little boy, a man by the name of Zebedee Coltrane. Now, I'll give you a little background on Zebedee Coltrane to kind of add some flavor to this. Zebedee Coltrane was one of the original members of the School of the Prophets in Kirtland with Joseph Smith. Saw some miraculous things, visions, etc. Later in his life, he'll settle in the Spanish Fork region in Utah and serve as a patriarch. Brother Coltrane he says that he could not sleep. He could not rest until he delivered a message to a young boy by the name of George Albert Smith. He went over and he delivered the message gave him his patriarchal blessing where he said that he would serve in the leading bodies of the church. He says, I need to give you this blessing. This won't go away until I give this to you. If you remember later in his life where George Herbert Smith was called in the Quorum of the 12, his health was poor and he does not serve, even though he's in the Quorum, he does not serve in his full capacity because of his health for a number of years. And when he was first called, he had this dream where his grandfather, George A. Smith, the cousin to the prophet Joseph Smith, came to him. He says, what have you done with my name? And he says, in that vision, his whole life passed before him. And he says, I've done nothing that would cause you any embarrassment. And I just think that heaven has their hand in some of these calls. There was another one, Bruce R. McConkie, before he was called in the Quorum of the 12, I believe he was down in Mexico at a stake conference. He was serving in the Quorum of the 70, and there was a vacancy in the 12, and they were doing the sustainings. You've been to a stake conference before where you go through the business and you do these sustainings. When they got to the end, he's on the stand listening to the names being read of the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12. When the final name, the 11th name was read, he heard his name immediately afterwards, Bruce R. McConkie. And he almost stopped the meeting. He goes, no, there's a mistake. You don't say my name with that Quorum of the 12, but nobody said it. It was the Spirit that whispered into his ear, giving him a little bit of warning. And so I think that some of these calls, as they're given, some are given a little bit of warning. And that warning is not always welcome. If I go back to Hubie Brown just for a second, we know the story, his really famous story about the currant bush, right? Yeah. And how he was a general, or excuse me, he wasn't a general. He was in a position to become a general. And that position was denied him because he was a Mormon. Later in his life, he will go into the oil industry and become quite wealthy. And he's on the verge of being very, very wealthy. And so he goes, he kneels down to pray one evening saying, God, if this money is going to corrupt me, take it away from me. If this wealth is going to change me, I don't want it. That evening, he began to pray and he just had these horrible feelings that came upon him. And so he began to pray harder, and he's in his office in his home by himself. It became late in the evening. His wife came in a little worried about him. His wife comes in and goes, Hugh, she walks in the room wondering where he is, why he didn't come to bed. He goes, Hugh, what is in this room? Something is in this room. And Hugh looked up from praying. He goes, it's the devil. He says, I'm being tormented and I have been tormented. He says, will you please kneel down and pray with me? And the two of them knelt down and prayed through the night to get some sort of relief. And the next day, Hubie Brown was called as an assistant to the 12. It's interesting that sometimes not only you get little glimpses of what's around the corner, but sometimes the adversary gets a tip, and John Taylor made the comment. He says, no president of the church has ever walked this earth without having the devil constantly at his elbow, that sometimes these calls are associated with just being worked over. Sometimes we work ourselves over, work ourselves up, because we feel unworthy. And sometimes when those feelings come, the adversary just stomps on it, and really amplifies that,
Yeah, that's helpful because there's sort of three areas that you sort of bring up. There's one, some of these individuals had an impression that came to them beforehand, sort of giving them a warning or preparing them. And that you still hear about happen quite a bit. And I always tell people, like at least my friends, like if that happens, just swallow it and don't say it over the podium when you're called, because 30 other men also had that impression and it didn't come. And then they sort of beat themselves up. So it's great if it happened. Just don't mention it. Yeah. So it'd be great. But and then also this tormenting. And I think that's really important to recognize because I had my own experience when I was called as bishop. The call came and I'm like, all right, yeah, let's do this. And it was about a week out before I'd be called. And I've never had an experience of being tormented. And this isn't like happened to everybody, but it was such a strong tormenting that I was convinced that for some reason, and I couldn't even pinpoint a moment or a transgression or a sin, but I was convinced that I was somehow unworthy for this. Like there was some deep transgression that I had done, right? Maybe it was a little OCD that was coming to the surface or whatnot, but it came to the point I called my stake president and I said, listen, I think there's something wrong here. There's something wrong with me. I'm unworthy to do this. And he basically said, no, you're fine. We'll see you Sunday. Move forward,
That's not bringing me out of it.
Yeah. But it really was this. I mean, in hindsight, I look back like this was a torment from the adversary that it was his last go at convincing me that I was worthless and couldn't lead. And so I think it's good for leaders just to hear that not that every leader that's called is going to be tormented, but it does happen. And so I appreciate the story of others that it can cripple you and really paralyze you of these calls, because the adversary does not want his keys to be passed on not his keys. The adversary doesn't want the Lord's keys to be passed on and exercised and these types of things. And then the third category is, I would imagine a lot of these people, like, nothing happens. Just like, wait, what? I'm in a meeting and I'm being called up. Like, wait a minute, can we talk about this first? So it's across the board of this sort of the uniqueness of this. But sometimes we have this tradition where we want to be like, oh yes, I've been knowing this call was coming, as if the Lord speaks in a special way to me. Like, well, whatever, man. Like sometimes it comes, sometimes it doesn't, and just, say yes to the calling, let's move forward, so.
Yeah. I think if you had those feelings, what would you do, a year in advance if you knew you were going to be in the Quorum of the 12 or whatever calling, fill in the blank? And I think the greatest advice is just get ready. Yeah. The call's going to come or it won't. And it's not bad advice just to get ready. God can use you in a lot of different ways. It doesn't need to be up front, but he does need people who are ready.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Awesome. And then as far as you mentioned here that the record for no movement in the 12 is 10 years. Is that saying that there was a vacancy in the 12 and 10 years passed, or what do you mean by that?
No. It happened once for 10 years and it happened once for 9, where no one in the Quorum 12 passed away.
Oh, okay.
Like a full decade. And they got to work together and function together. It happened back in the 1920s, and then it happened again in the 1990s.
Yeah. President Eyring was the junior member of the Quorum. Right?
Yeah. Now, keep this in mind. Statistically speaking, we can expect a change in the 12. This sounds a little morbid, about every 3 years.
Yeah.
That off average, that's about safe to say that something's going to happen. And so think about over your life and on the great men who have moved on, and new individuals get called in the 12. But this succession, this movement in the 12 happens fairly regularly, and so we should be prepared and understand how this all functions.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think, there's a lot of talk when, who was it? The Rasband, Stevenson, and Renlund were called 3 members, 3 vacancies at one time. And that's sort of anomaly, but it's happened maybe a handful of times. I don't know if there's ever been 4 or 5, but
in the days of Joseph Smith, man, that quorum got torn apart. But if we exclude him, it's only happened one other time where 3 were called into the 12 at the same time. Typically, what happens is you're ordained by age. So the older individual, that age issue is still an issue, And so, for instance, President Kimball and President Benson were called at the same time, and Kimball was called first because he was older. One thing that's kind of unusual is we have 3 individuals that were not ordained according to age. And so it's caused some kind of, what's going on? I don't know if individuals were called and then another vacancy opened up, so another call was given. I don't know the timing of the calls. That could be it. Or just by inspiration that God says, I need this order, so.
Yeah, and that is tradition. Like when Elder Uchtdorf and Elder Bednar were called together, Elder Uchtdorf is older, so he is ordained as more senior in the quorum. I mean, you assume that anyways, not that they come out and say that. And same with President Nelson, which had impact on who was prophet, right? President Nelson and President Oakes called at the same time, but President Nelson is older, and so he was sustained and more senior, right? Interesting. I was going to ask about, so in the history, this office of being called to the Quorum of the 70, that used to be a until death calling. Is that right? And then that was changed, the emeritus status, or? Yeah.
So emeritus, they go emeritus at age 70. In fact, that was something that Hugh B. Brown proposed to the first presidency. He says, some of these guys are getting older, maybe we should let the Quorum of the 12 go emeritus also. And that was a no-go. Another stint of that was President Hunter. When he was ordained or set apart as president of the church, he really kind of, advocated, hey, listen, I'm old. My health isn't good. No harm, no foul. Let's, switch things around. It was during that same era, for instance, that Marion G. Romney was in the Quorum of the 12, but he wasn't president of the 12, even though he was senior. His health was so poor that we had an acting member of the 12 functioning because the senior member of the 12, his health couldn't sustain it. And so, there has been times where help has been an issue, but you're absolutely right. The Quorum of the 12, that is a call for your life. What was it? Robert D. Hales. He was called to be a mission president, but he hadn't gotten his assignment yet. And so eventually the assignment was kind of wishy-washy for a minute. And so they called him and says, hey, would you mind if we changed your assignment? And he says, hey, I'll go wherever you want to be a mission president. I'm excited to serve. He says, well, we're going to change the assignment slightly. You won't be a mission president. He goes, I'll serve wherever you want me to serve. He goes, and it's going to be longer than 3 years. He goes, what do you mean? He's like, we're asking for the balance of your life.
Wow.
And that was to be an assistant to the 12. And later he will serve as a presiding bishop and then the Quorum of the 12. But when they extended the call to him, this is, we're asking for the balance of your life. There's no end date to this. And
yeah. Well, this is awesome. Any other story or that you want to make sure we fit in here before we wrap up? Or we could ramble on. There's so many just really, really fun stories. But I think now might be a good breaking point. Yeah, sure. And I was going to ask, and maybe your book is in the works, but I mean, if somebody wants to learn more about some of these stories, and because you have a whole list here that some we didn't have time to touch on, but where would you send people if they really want to dig in and learn about this history?
Yeah, all these stories that I've told and many more are in a book I co-authored with a friend named Patrick Bishop called Apostolic Succession in the Restoration.
Oh, cool.
Now that title just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? The original title was The First 100 Apostles. Then we had 102. So,
yeah.
But Apostolic Succession, the Restoration is what we've.
Awesome.
All these stories are easy to find.
Cool. Yeah, we'll definitely link to that so people can check it out and put it on their bookshelves for these fun stories from time to time. So, Kevin, let me just ask you the final question is: as you've had opportunity to really study just this model, I guess you could say, a restored model or part of the restoration, not that. It's hard to say that God had this envision of how he wanted to work and he was waiting for everybody to come around. Sometimes maybe these things just came together, but how has that helped your faith and testimony in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ?
Yeah. This restored gospel is a gospel of revelation. This is a gospel of new light, and there's more things to come. If we could sit down maybe 50 years from now and talk about succession in the presidency, the Quorum of the 12 and the first presidency might look different. But one thing that's going to remain is we are led by priesthood keys. I love how God, throughout this, studying the lives of these individuals has taught me something, that God is the master teacher, that God knows what he's doing as he is teaching individuals to grow into who they need to be, to grow into individuals who they never dreamed they could become. And God is doing that with all of us in a very real way. Very few of us are going to serve as president of the church, as counselors, or in the Quorum of the 12. And that's not the message. The message is God can use anyone and help them grow into amazing things. God is amazing that way. He is the master teacher, the master tutor, as he helps us grow into beyond what we can even imagine.
That concludes this episode of the Leading Saints podcast. We'd love to hear from you about your questions or thoughts or comments. You can either leave a comment on the post related to this episode at leadingsaints.org or go to leadingsaints.org/contact and send us your perspective or questions. If there's other episodes or topics you'd like to hear on the Leading Saints podcast, go to leadingsaints.org/contact and share with us the information there. And we would love for you to share this with any individual you think this would apply to, especially maybe individuals in your ward council or other leaders that you may know who would really appreciate the perspectives that we discussed. And remember, text the word LEAD to 474747 in order to access the 3 free sessions of the LGBT Saints Library.
It came as a result of the position of leadership which was imposed upon us by the God of heaven, who brought forth a restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when the declaration was made concerning the only true and living church upon the face of the earth, we were immediately put in a position of loneliness, the loneliness of leadership, from which we cannot shrink nor run away, and to which we must face up with boldness and courage and ability.